Hi everyone, I'm the plant propagator and welcome to my channel. Today it is a beautiful day here in Southwest Florida, and what I wanted to share with you today are not really these orchids per se, but a little bit of my philosophy on orchid improvement. So I want to talk about improving orchid genetics. So let me explain a little bit about my background. So I have my PhD in plant physiology, and I spent my career in a plant biotechnology laboratory in the Midwest United States. PhD, what it stands for, it's a doctorate of philosophy. And so it gives me the opportunity, and what you're supposed to do is say, well, I like to philosophize about science and about various things related to the work that I do. And that's what I want to share with you today is I want to talk to you a little bit about orchid genetics and, more importantly, improvement. This is an area that I've gotten into mostly since I retired from the university about 4 years ago. And I spent my career at the university working on soybeans. And I worked with other plants, other crops that are located in the Midwest US, but I worked on soybean not because of a love of soybeans, but because that's where the money is. So soybeans it's a $30 billion crop. And working with soybeans, it was a good situation where I could do basic research on crop improvement, but I could also generate funding that would fund the 15 people that I had in my laboratory. I've separated myself from that now, so I have just a few people in my laboratory, and I don't have to generate the large grants or the large amount of money that I did in my previous career. But I do have a lot of experience in crop improvement, and when I was working in this, I was a geneticist. I'm not really sure I was a breeder per se, but I was more of a biotechnologist and a molecular biologist. So I did a lot of improvement of soybean, but the soybean, I developed methodologies for crop improvement, and those were applied to soybean by a number of different people. I didn't do everything myself, but I developed technologies that then other people used to improve the crop. But I got to learn a lot about soybeans. I actually am from a city, a large city in the Midwest US. I'm not a farmer by background or training or anything like that, but I've learned a lot about improvement, and I've really learned a lot working for 35 years on soybean. I should say, before I work on soybeans, I worked on cotton, and it's because, again, that also paid the bills, and it was another crop plant. And I did some things with cotton that very few other people have done, and I've done some things with soybean that, again, the same thing. It's difficult for most people to do, but it led to some huge increases in crop improvement, and it led to having a large impact on soybean in the United States as well as worldwide. Okay, so let me back up a little. Now, I guess I should explain one more thing to you. I'll give you a little bit more about my credentials. I have my Society for In Vitro Biology shirt on right now, and I was heavily involved in that society. It is a tissue culture and biotechnology society, and I'm a fellow in that society. I'm also a fellow in AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So I have a background that I wanted to talk with you, and I just want to make sure that that's weighed properly. And I want to talk to you about, again, genetics. Okay, so let's get back to soybean. Soybean is a tremendously improved plant through the efforts of breeding and genetics and cultural improvement. So what I want to do is split things up. So I want to talk with you today about orchid genetics and orchid improvement using genetic approaches. I'll give another video. I'll put another video together on cultural improving orchids through cultural manipulations. And a lot of this, both the genetics and the cultural manipulations, I want to base it in terms of what the orchids that grow naturally, because, you know, orchids, soybeans, everything, there are plants, and there were plants that grow naturally, either ancestors or, you know, plants that are native that are not cultivated. And that's really a lot more so the case in orchids. But in soybeans, that's also the case. So over the past, I think over the past 100 years, there's been a 5-fold increase in soybean yields, and that's yields per acre. That's bushels per acre. So that's in the last 100 years. But that steps you way back. Soybean is a relatively new crop. Let's talk about the past 25 years in soybean yield increases. And through, again, genetics and cultural improvements, how they grow the crop, how the farmers grow the crop, there's been roughly a 50% increase in yield. And that to me is striking. And the yield curve just keeps on going up. It has to level out eventually, I think. But that's important. That's the main thing that's important in the soybean world. When you talk with, and I used to talk, I'm not a soybean farmer, but I used to talk to the soybean farmers a lot. The soybean farmers actually formed a group that then supported research. And that was really nice to have access to what the farmers think, and that they would consider funding the type of work that we did in the laboratory, that it would eventually, again, make its way into the field, which it did in our situation. When you talk with the soybean farmers and you say, okay, what's important to you? They said 3 things: yield, yield, and yield. And so they're mostly concerned with that. Now, when you look at soybean as a crop, there are other things, you know, soybean is a very high oil and protein producing crop. And so you look at the balance of that. Some situations you do want higher oil, some situations you want higher protein. You always want resistance, but to pathogens and pests and things like that. But the way that you measure that is through yield. So they wanted yield, and they've gotten yield increases. Again, the most recent numbers that I have is over the past 25 years, there's been a 50%, which is a huge increase in soybean yield. And that's what the farmers are interested in, that's what they got. I've seen wild soybean. Not in the United States, but when I was traveling in Korea, I was out walking in a field, and there was this vine that was growing up around all these plants, and that was the ancestral soybean lines. The yield on that is like nothing. And you say the same thing about a number of different plants. You can see the ancestors of, you know, tomato, and they've got like little BB-sized tomato. You see the ancestors of corn, and they've got little small grains on what we know as corn today. So there's been tremendous improvements in all of these crops through genetics, but, you know, again, also cultural practices, which we'll get to next. So I've seen the ancestors of soybean growing in fields in Korea, and they don't look much like soybeans. You don't get much out of them, but they were there, and the genetics what was there, and then the idea is to improve them in a number of different ways. Okay, let's get back to orchids now. We're at the very, in my opinion, we're at the very early stages of orchid improvement. And when you say orchid improvement, what are we looking for? Well, most of the orchid world, what they want is 3 things: flower, flower, flower. So you look at the type of flower that you want on an orchid, the size, the coloration, a number of different features related, and it's kind of the same thing but different. What I try to do also when I'm looking at orchids and what I'm dealing with, I also like to have vigorous plants, pathogen resistance, and a number of different things. Okay, so how do you start? First of all, what are the wild orchids? What are the native orchids? And what are then these things? And I do have some native orchids behind me, but I don't have any of them on the table in front of me right now. So I'm also a member of the Florida Native Plant Society, and there's very specific guidelines for what is a native plant. So native plants are ones that are found naturally growing, that are documented of growing in certain spaces. The other thing is, if you make any type of improvements to these native plant populations simply by selecting, you know, a variant that looks good or a plant that seems to be growing a little bit better, then you kind of lose that natural tag. What the native plant people are looking for is native populations that carry the native diversity of the plants that are out there. So what happens in the orchid world is there's a lot of selection that goes on. So as you see these native populations, if you have, you know, certain plants that you like, those are what you're naturally drawn to. But then again, it loses its natural tag when that happens. But in the orchid world, that's not quite as pronounced. You don't see that. There's a lot of native plants that have been improved. Native plants, I also should say, are in the orchid world we refer to as species. So I think all of the orchid species, the ones that are called species, are native, and they're native to different parts of the world. So you can have this one that might be native to, you know, to Guatemala, to Costa Rica, there are natives in Florida also. And so these are, again, native plants that are species, but you have to be, once they're improved a little bit, they're still called species, but they're not as native as they used to be. And this is what the orchid world is doing. Now, the amazing thing about this is when you're talking about soybean, it's one genus, one species, Glycine max. When you're talking about orchids, there are so many different genera and so many different species. There's 30,000 different species in the orchid world. And then a lot of them are compatible. So for example, this one is compatible with this one, is compatible with this one as far as being able to hybridize them. Now, are some of these going to be occurring in nature? Yes, but are the species that they come from, is hybridization going to be occurring in those species? And the answer is yes, but mostly no. Because how do you get a plant from Costa Rica to cross with a plant that's in the United States? And how about when they bloom different times of the year? What's going to happen then? And so you're going to have some issues. Now, through intervention, through genetics, through improvement, I can take the pollen. I can actually get all of the plants together in one location that are originated in different locations all over the world. I can then also harvest the pollen from these plants and store them for a year or longer, and then I can take the pollen from my pollinia collection in my refrigerator and cross different plants. So you can start to see the type of improvements genetically that you can make when you cross all of these different plants, as long as they're compatible. The compatibility issues they're there, but you can expand that a little bit. So we can learn how to cross one plant onto the other. In some cases, you can make what's called a wide cross from two very distantly but related species that are compatible. And you can bring unique genetics together in ways that have never been done before. And that's what really excites me about orchid genetics and orchid improvement. So in this case, again, you have human intervention for genetic improvement of orchids. Okay, where is the potential here? What can you do? Well, you can do a lot of different things depending on what you're looking at. In nature, when the plants pollinate and produce seed, orchid seeds, there's a lot of seeds in capsules. So I've got a capsule right here. I've got a capsule on this plant right here because I'm crossing these plants with each other. And there can be upwards of 3 million, that's not the high level, but usually 500,000 to 2 million seed in each one of these capsules. Small seed, they're wind spread, and they have to land in exactly the right place, usually on a tree, but at exactly the right place in the bark. You got to get down in the folds in the bark, and they have to have the right moisture. They have to be a fungus that's there that supports the growth of the orchid embryo within the seed, and you have to have the conditions just right. So really, only the best plants, only the ones that land in the right place, that are vigorous enough, will survive. So there's a little bit of selection. And so there's something that goes on, there's evolution, there's selection, and usually you have the most vigorous or the most adaptable plants will survive in nature. When you look at native plants growing in nature, you won't see stuff like this. You'll see similar things, but you won't see these. These are all hybrids that are made with the different species that are out there, and their various combinations and amounts of the various species that are in these hybrids. But you get an unusual, in nature, you get these plants and they grow out. And in many cases, they're growing like in the back, they're growing on this, mounted on trees and in bark. And there are terrestrials that are just in the right places in the soil or in a riverbed or something like this. And again, you'll have survival of a very small amount of plants in very specific places. But it's a very low survival rate. Only a few, because you're producing, a million seed, only a few of those will survive. And we'll talk about cultural practices. What we do now is we have a much higher percentage by plating the seeds in a laboratory. You have a very high survival rate, so you can see a lot more of the diversity that you're not going to see in the wild. You can then pull out, because these may not be the fittest plants, they may not be the most vigorous plants, but through human intervention, we can get them to survive. But that's another story. That's cultural, orchid culture and cultural conditions, and we're going to talk about that more in an upcoming video. Okay, again, the potential for improvement of these plants is enormous. What are we going for? What are we doing? Well, different people go for different things. Again, most of the people in the orchid world are interested in flowers and how the flowers look. I love fragrance, so I actually only cross orchids that to me have fragrance. This is Amazing Thailand, and there's actually 2 capsules. I made 2 pollinations on Amazing Thailand, but this is it's just an incredible flower, and it smells like rose, and it's a nice, vigorous, look at it, it's a nice big plant that's growing out of a small pot. Everything's growing upright. So this is the type of characteristic and feature that I look for in my orchids. This one has a little bit of a smaller shape and smaller size. So sometimes, take a plant like this, cross it with something, get a little bit more of a star-shaped flower here in a smaller plant. This has, look how floriferous this is. So this has 10 blooms on. This is Fushu Glory right here. And so I look at these characteristics, I look at these features, and I try to cross the appropriate plants together to get plants that are floriferous, that have really nice flower quality, really nice colors, fragrance, vigor. Vigor is very important. When you make these orchids, one of the things that I do that's interesting is that I make a lot of seedlings. So behind me are some of my seedlings that are in 4-inch pots, and they're starting to get big. I'm going to have a video on some of these seedlings just because I want to share how nice the seedlings look and how much they've grown over the past year to 2 years with some of these guys. But I select the seedlings that grow in my environment. So I like the ones that grow in my yard. Those are the ones that are going to survive, the ones that are, and I selectively pull out the most vigorous plants from the populations that I generate in the laboratory. And this is what I use. So there's some selection going on for a number of features, including, flower, but also vigor, pathogen resistance, and fragrance, showiness, all of this stuff. So there's a lot of things that can be done when you consider that you can cross these orchids that are from different parts of the world that will flower at different times of the year. And then you can break some genetic boundaries that couldn't be broken before until we intervened. Orchids have been around for a long time, and they've flourished and they've done well. But I think once we're doing, but these types of colors don't exist in nature. I like these improved colors and these improved forms and resistances and these types of things. The species are nice. Natural orchids are nice. I certainly grow them, and I know that there's a real interest in having those. But I really like myself being able to improve these genetically through breeding and genetics to get the perfect orchid. All right, that's all I have today. I wanted to give you kind of my overview and my philosophy on orchid genetics and orchid improvement and what has been done and how I'm trying to contribute to this area. All right, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did and you want to keep on seeing them, it would help me out if you can click on like, share, and subscribe to my channel if you're not already a subscriber. All right, that's all I have for you. Again, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and happy propagating.